Okay.
It's an article from 10 or more years ago about Joe sitting on the stage.
Okay.
At this point, Harriet, I think maybe you just have to start talking and jump in.
I am neither a historian nor a professional genealogist, but for the last 300 years, my family has assiduously kept documents and told family stories. For years, I said that whoever picked up the mantle from my grand aunt, I would help them the rest of my life. But guess what? Nobody steps up. So, this project started, I think, about 12 years ago. I talked my first cousin and my brother into assembling our collection of family documents and turning them over to the South Carolina Library in Columbia. When they accepted the material, the first thing Dr. Stokes told me was, this material is publishable. If you are willing to write a book, we will underwrite the cost and assist you with it. That is an offer that is hard to turn your back on, but I didn't realize that it would take 12 years to do it. Nevertheless, I turned the manuscript in 3 years ago, and the rest of it has been dragging since then. I started by sorting over 50 letters that James Birchall Richardson wrote to my third great-grandfather, William Sinkler, and decided to transcribe them. For 20 years, I have searched for the other half of the correspondence with no luck. I have put queries in magazines, searched far and wide. I've come to the conclusion that the Richardson homes that were burned over the years probably destroyed all those documents. In the ensuing years, I have found a few at various repositories in the Southern Collection at Duke University, for instance, and a couple at the Historical Society. Nevertheless, let's talk about the period of time where these comprise. I'd like to put the time period in a little historic perspective. The following things were going on in the world. The Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin. In 1801, South Carolina paid $50,000 to Phineas Miller and Eli Whitney for the right of South Carolina planters to use what was called a saw gin. An 1806 letter, one that I transcribed, discusses the specifics of building such a gin at Utah Plantation. In this country, the capital was being moved from Philadelphia to Washington. The Lewis and Clark expedition was pushing westward. Foreign slave trade was officially ended, this in 1808. In South Carolina, the capital was moved from Charleston to Columbia. Cotton replaced indigo. Remember, indigo was no longer a viable crop with the Revolution. That dried up the export business. And cotton emerged about in the 1790s. Malaria was rampant. At least one historian credits James Sinkler with being the first to move his family from June through November of 1793 to the higher Pine Land because, of course, they thought at that time that malaria, which was not identified by that name, but it was assumed that it was caused by what was called swamp miasma, and people needed to get to higher ground. It was nearly the 20th century before they realized that it was indeed mosquitoes, and then of course we got DDT. There was also yellow fever and cholera. There was a major epidemic in 1836. And frequently, if you're looking at genealogy charts and you see lots of deaths at a particular time, it could very well be related to one of these epidemics. The Santee Canal was incorporated in 1786. This was an attempt to tie Columbia and Charleston together through the Santee and the Cooper Rivers. South Carolina College, which became the University of South Carolina, was chartered in 1801 and opened in 1805. The College of Charleston opened in 1839. The Citadel in 1842. The Charleston to Columbia Railroad was built in 1842. Don't we wish we had that today? The first telegraph between Columbia and Charleston emerged in 1848. This is a Mills map. I'm not going to read you the specifics off of this, but the Richardsons lived up in this area, and this is the Santee River we're talking about. Nelson's Ferry, and I will have to credit the Department of Archaeology and History for Archives and History for merging these two maps, because they're two separate maps. The Nelson's Ferry Road followed along here and crossed at Nelson's Ferry and then went on the south side down toward Utah Springs. The Sinklers at that time lived in this area. If we had the rest of the map, William Sinkler was born to James, who lived at what was called Old Santee, which is 4 miles southeast of town of St. Stephen. And the Nelson Ferry Road would have followed all this way. So when they're visiting, that's the route that they would have to take. There are no images or land records that I can find, but Richard Richardson's will left Manor Plantation and considerable acreage to his son James B. Richardson. James is the one we will center our attention to for this purpose. Although Dorothy, the mother, had the use of it for her life. James B. appears also to have inherited Mama's Hall, about which we know very little, other than the fact that that's where he was living when he died. In 1769, James Sinkler, with his older half-brother Peter, purchased 800 acres near Utah Springs, right down into here, which eventually, the Utah Creek cut across that property, and eventually Utah and Belvedere plantations were built. Okay, advanced. I haven't figured out how to use it. All right, George, which way am I supposed to be pointing? There we go. This is Belvedere Plantation, which James Sinkler died in 1800 before he had actually moved there, and his widow completed it. Sorry, punched the wrong button. I'll figure this out before it ends. I have not been able to find an image of the Nelson's Ferry. Benson Lossing, who wrote several books about it, evidently did not do a sketch of the ferry itself. The only one I found that he did was an image of the location that had a little mound beside the river and a tree growing up, which doesn't tell you what a ferry looks like. But this is apparently pretty much the way. I have talked to several people who are more knowledgeable than I, and this seems to be the type of ferry that would have crossed the Santee River. There's little specific information of the river conditions right at Nelson Ferry, which was at the confluence of Utah Creek and the Santee River. But a few miles downriver at White Oak Landing, which was sometimes called Brachet's Bluff, the Santee was normally 270 feet wide and 18 to 20 feet deep. Ferry rates varied, being doubled in times of high water or what were called freshes. According to the statutes at large of South Carolina, in 1799, the rates varied from, quote, 12.5 cents for a man on a horse to 75 cents for a four-wheel carriage or a wagon with a team and driver. There were no fees for ministers, soldiers, women, men on militia duty, or people attending church. All right. I'm still not pointing it right. Okay. This is a sign that's located just southeast of Utah Springs on part of the remains of Nelson's Ferry Road. There's probably another one south of Manning in the Santee National Wildlife Refuge. Is anyone familiar with the sign being there? Okay, that's for another day. I have a question. How many of you have Sinkler ancestry? Would you raise your hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. How many of you are descended from either James Burchell Richardson or his two younger brothers, John Peter and Charles Richardson? I am shocked. I would have thought there were more. What about Mannings? Any Manning descendants in here?
It was a very friendly family.
Well, I had anticipated that there would be lots of Richardson descendants and very few Sinkler. And I was going to have a laugh at sorting you out and saying, if you're descended from James Burchell Richardson, you're descended from Sinklers. Because James, oh, this is the wrong chart, sorry. We'll get back to that. James Burchell Richardson and William Sinkler were related through Jane or Jean Garrard, whose daughter Dorothy was married to Richard Richardson, and whose son James Sinkler was married to first Sarah Candy, but she was married twice, to Sarah Candy and then to Margaret Candy. We'll get back to that chart in a minute. These are the only two photos that I could find of Richard Richardson and James Burchell. They would have known each other through serving in the First Continental Congress, representing Camden and St. Stephen's districts in later legislatures. James Sinkler owned property in St. Mark's Parish near Richard, and James Sinkler's older half-brother Peter was a close friend of Richard Richardson's. He was named as an executor on his will. They had both been imprisoned by the British in Charleston. All right, back to the chart. Margaret Candy, who was already the first cousin of Sarah's daughter, well, let's go back this way. Margaret Candy was mother of William Sinkler. James had first been married to Sarah, who had Anne Canty Sinkler, who married James Richardson, which meant that Margaret was already the aunt of Anne and James Burchell Richardson. But when they married, James Burchell became the brother-in-law of William Sinkler, and Margaret became his mother-in-law. Got all that straight? It cannot be overemphasized how the Richardson nephews adored Margaret. Letters attest to this, especially one of July 1799 from John Peter, who was James Burchell's younger brother, complaining about not receiving more letters from her. Starting about 1809, until at least 1818, John Peter's teenage daughter, Elizabeth, who was called Betsy, carried on a correspondence with Margaret, who was her grand aunt. Betsy's grandmother was a let's look at that chart a minute. Betsy's grandmother, Betsy's down here at the bottom, her grandmother was a sister to Margaret Candy. Both the great-grandmothers had been married to Charles Candy, but Margaret married James Sinkler, and Elizabeth Candy married Renee Peer. And her daughter married John Peter Richardson, and they had Betsy. Now, Betsy is an interesting personage in that she was related to 5 different South Carolina governors. Her uncle, James Burchell Richardson, was governor from 1802. She married Richard Irving Manning, who became governor. She was the sister to John Peter Richardson, the mother of Lawrence Manning, and I'm going to show you another chart that goes even a little bit further. Betsy, let's see where she is, right here in the middle. She married Richard Irving Manning. They had a son. No, he became governor. They had a son, Richard Irving Manning Jr., who married Elizabeth Allen Sinkler, the daughter of William Sinkler, and they had a son, Richard Irving Manning III, who became governor. Her other son, John Lawrence Manning, was governor in 1852. So she was related to 5 different South Carolina governors. You all sorted all that out, I hope.
They needed the developer circle.
Okay. James B. Richardson. I wish I had a better image. That's the best I can do. When William Sinkler was 13 years old in 1800, his father, James Sinkler, died, leaving Margaret with 1 son who had completed school and with 3 young children. James Burchell Richardson stepped in to mentor William, probably in part because he had lost his father when he was 10 years old, and he remembered what it was like to be orphaned, and he always regretted his lack of education, formal education. This started a correspondence that lasted for 35 years until James Burchell Richardson died. One of the first decisions that was made after James's death was to send William to school, first in Charleston and shortly thereafter to Newport, Rhode Island, to the Rogers School. There were numerous South Carolina families who sent their children to the North for education. And later, when he finished that school, he went on to Harvard for a couple of years, always referred to in letters simply as Cambridge. Early letters from James to William are comprised of considerable advice, such as an 1801 admonition that, quote, "In a place like Charleston, vices of every species are daily exhibited to the human eye," end quote. And he warned William that you might, quote, "at length fall a victim and become an admirer of those vices," end quote. There's no evidence that William ever disappointed his mother or James, fortunately. Decisions regarding William's education appear to have been made jointly by Margaret and James Burchell Richardson, but an early letter Margaret wrote to her son encouraged him to take James's advice and express his gratitude, which he appears to have done. Travel between Charleston and the North was no small matter. We're talking about an ocean voyage, remember. Another relative who kept a journal noted that the trip took 14 to 20 days going north and 9 to 11 days coming south. Margaret sometimes accompanied her son, and more regularly when her daughter Margaret Anna became old enough to attend school in Philadelphia. Transferring money was another tricky issue. Letters frequently note the enclosure of specific amounts of money, sometimes being split between two letters or sent by others. For instance, James Burchell would send money to William when he was in Cambridge, and he would make a note in the letter, the other $50 or $100 is being sent by your mother. It's also worth noting that William frequently was tasked with settling up his accounts in school, even when before he was in college. He frequently would do that. Most of these letters from James Burchell were dateline Jamesville, with no mention of specific plantation names or asylum, which was the name that was given to the summer home. I have not been able to find any images of any of these. It's unfortunate, but I guess they've all burned. It is not known when William Sinkler returned from Cambridge, but the first letter that confirms his being back in South Carolina was in 1805. He was probably living at Belvedere, which you saw a photo earlier, with his mother, where he would have been preparing for the construction of Utah, across Utah Creek. Now let's see if we can get that one up. From at least the age of 13, William had made plans for how he wanted to build a plantation home. And he had shared these plans with Benjamin King, a builder in Charleston, who ultimately did build the plantation. And King had told him at that time that he would build the plantation for him when he had someone to share it with. So by the time William built Utah, which was around 1810, he was married. He started building it in 1808. But by the time he moved in, he was married to Elizabeth Allen Brown. In any case, for the next 30 years, letters centered on business, politics, sharing of skilled labor, trading property. And I can imagine these men sitting around a dinner table after the ladies have retired to discuss their business. I can imagine one of them looking at the other one and saying, "Hey, Bubba, you know that 20 acres that extends out in the northeast? If you swap that to me, that would straighten up our property line." And the reason I say that, because numerous land records show pieces of property transferring hands. And there may be other reasons, but I suspect that was a lot of it. Starting about, lost my place, horse racing, pardon my lapses. For the next 30 years, letters centered on property trading and starting in 1808, horse racing issues. Also, James Burchell's political history, most of you probably know. He was very active in local politics and served as governor from 1801 to 1803. It appears that he tried to interest his brother-in-law William to run for political office in Berkeley County, which he did one time. He lost, and that was the end of it. I suspect, because not much was said about it, that William probably felt that he had fulfilled his obligation to James to at least try, because he never showed any interest in running for political office again. Horse racing was another matter. James B. Richardson's name appeared in Charleston racing from about 1793. He would have been in his 20s. And William from about 1807. It is not known exactly what spurred this interest in horse racing, but we know that Richard Richardson had such regard for his last horse that the horse was buried in the Richardson Cemetery Does anyone know the name of that horse? I'm trying to get the slide to advance. Okay, Snowdrop it is. James Richardson built a racetrack at Manchester, near Pinewood. William had one at Utah. There was also one at Belvedere. All of these are long gone, of course. The Belvedere racetrack was revived briefly during the 1930s. Anybody ever been to a Lansing tournament? Yeah, okay, a few of you. They did have those at Belvedere in the 30s, along with the conventional races. This is the Utah Avenue. The horses and sheep, of course, apparently had free run of the avenue. Letters are replete with references to breeding and trading details and sharing trainers and grooms. The first time I read a letter of July 1806, this is one for James Burchell Richardson to William Sinkler. I reread it several times before I realized that a reference to Nancy being ill referred to a racehorse, not a family member. Because he's chatting along about what all the family is doing, who's doing what, and he's all concerned about how ill Nancy is and what has to be done for her. Does anyone recognize this race course? We know it's in Charleston. Do you recognize any street names?
Somebody Citadel.
It is just east of the Citadel. You're absolutely right.
Hampton Park.
It is Hampton Park. You're absolutely right. How many people have been to Hampton Park in Charleston? Did you know that it had been a race course? Well, that's what it was. Mary Mead Drive that circles around through Hampton Park was the race course. And I find that interesting. Unfortunately, the press wouldn't let me include that in my book, but I think it's still a good image. In 1833, James Burchell Richardson won all the main races at the Washington Race Course, plus the sweepstakes, a total of 5 races over the course of 4 days. He was only the 3rd person to have done so, the early ones in 1800 and 1827. This is a Sinkler jockey suit. It was originally red. It's silk. It's now very much faded. It's in my possession. Being a seamstress, I can appreciate the tiny stitches that hold that together. It would have taken ages to have made. I don't have any proof of it, but James's wife, Anne, who was William's half-sister, may have made it. She was known to have made lots of what she called horse clothes. There are 2 more of these, one of velvet, the other one silk, in the Charleston Museum. But I'm quite sure that it involved months of sitting on the front porch sewing by hand, because this was long before the advent of the sewing machine. So everything was little tiny stitches holding it together. But a lot of her letters reference progress in making some of these clothes, and it's known from her letters that she did make some of them for her brother. She mentions, in one of them, I could have done a better job if I'd had a little more time, but I was trying to get it ready. Well, I told you I was that before I finish, but I'm not sure I'm going to. Okay. This is a trophy that William was presented by the Pineville Jockey Club. Even though they couldn't spell jockey correctly. It's believed that it was awarded for general excellence in racing, but the Sinkler family has traditionally associated it with a horse named Jeanette Berkeley, who was a frequent winner at these races. William Sinkler had a trainer named Hercules that frequently in letters, they'll say, call him Old Harp. But he was very famous and he was very popular, and many horse owners approached William to have him either send Hercules to stay with them for a month to train horses, or they would take horses to Utah to be trained by Hercules. And one other point that I want to make about this, yes, these were slaves. And we abhor the fact that that happened. But many of these, Hercules being one, had considerable freedom to move around. There are numerous letters that mention his taking money from James Burchell Richardson, having been paid for some service or something he had bought for William Sinkler. And Hercules would take the money back and forth. Also, there were several letters that mentioned when one of James Burchell's sons, I think it was William H.B., was at Carolina, well, it was South Carolina College then, and he wanted a horse for a weekend. One of the slaves took the horse to Columbia for the younger William Richardson to use. And evidently, the man, the slave, got ill. So another one was sent with money to be sure that he got medical care and got home. So these are people who had fairly high responsible positions, and they were recognized for that.